Beneath the streets of Rome, in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, lies a labyrinth of secrets. Some are carved in stone, others written in ancient texts. But the most dangerous secrets, these have been passed down through whispers. For nearly 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has maintained that Jesus Christ lived and died a celibate man. His mission was divine, not dynastic. His legacy spiritual, not genetic. This is the foundation upon which Western Christianity built its theology, its power, and its understanding of the divine. But here, in the ancient streets where Jesus once walked, a different story has persisted. A whisper that refuses to die, that resurfaces throughout history, like a truth that cannot remain buried. The whisper of a bloodline. The early Christian movement was far more diverse than many people realize. What we call orthodoxy now was just one of many interpretations and questions about Jesus' human relationships, particularly with Mary Magdalene, were actively debated in those first centuries. In the Gospel of Philip, a text excluded from the biblical canon, there are tantalizing suggestions. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. But what if this relationship went beyond spiritual companionship? What if, contrary to established church doctrine, Jesus and Mary Magdalene were husband and wife? And what if ... there were children? The idea surfaces first in the turbulent years following Christ's crucifixion. While the official accounts tell us that Mary Magdalene witnessed the resurrection and then fades from biblical narrative, alternative histories suggest a far more dramatic journey. According to these persistent legends, Mary Magdalene fled the persecution in Jerusalem, carrying with her something more precious than any relic, a child of royal and divine lineage, a living continuation of the bloodline of Jesus himself. She did not travel alone. Historical accounts place a strange group of early Christians arriving on the shores of southern France around 42 CE. Mary Magdalene, her sister Martha, her brother Lazarus, and a mysterious child referred to in some obscure texts as Sarah, the daughter of the divine. In the marshlands of what is now called Saintes Maries de la Mer, these refugees found safety. The local traditions speak of Mary Magdalene living out her days in a cave, now the site of pilgrimage at Les Saintes-Baumes. But while the Church would later canonize Mary as a repentant sinner, they remained conspicuously silent about her possible descendants. This silence itself became part of the mystery. When you examine the historical record, there are curious gaps, places where documents should exist but don't. In the 4th century, when Constantine embraced Christianity and the Church began consolidating power, we see a systematic effort to control the narrative about Jesus' life and legacy. What truths might have been buried in this process? The bloodline theory gained unexpected support from an unlikely source, the ritual practices of European royalty. Throughout the Dark Ages and into medieval times, the kings of the Merovingian dynasty in France claimed a sacred origin distinct from other monarchs. They wore their hair long in the Nazarite tradition. They bore titles that hinted at divine, right beyond the conventional understanding, and they were said to possess supernatural abilities, healing powers, reminiscent of those attributed to Jesus himself. When the last Merovingian king was deposed in 751 CE, historical records suggest A curious involvement of the Church in this power transition. The Vatican, still consolidating its influence across Europe, appeared to have a vested interest in severing this particular royal line, while preserving certain bloodlines through strategic marriages into other noble houses. The whispers grew louder in the 12th century, when a mysterious order of knights became the guardians of secrets that threatened to reshape Christianity itself. The Knights Templar, founded ostensibly to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, gained unprecedented autonomy from both church and state. During excavations beneath the Temple Mount, they reportedly discovered scrolls and artifacts that connected to this hidden history. Within decades, they had become the most powerful organization in medieval Europe, answering only to the Pope himself. Their sudden wealth and influence raised questions that persist to this day. What had they found? What did they know? And why did the Church eventually turn against them with such brutal efficiency? The suppression of the Templars in 1307 marked one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune. On Friday, the 13th of October, in a coordinated operation across Europe, Templar knights were arrested, tortured, and executed. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, burned at the stake, proclaimed his innocence, and called his persecutors to meet him at Heaven's Gate within a year. Both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV of France, the architects of the Templar downfall, would indeed die within that time frame. But what knowledge died with them? What secrets about a sacred bloodline might have been silenced in those flames? The whisper of a bloodline continues through history, through the works of Renaissance artists who embedded coded references in their masterpieces, through secret societies that preserved ancient knowledge, through families who maintained private traditions at odds with church doctrine. It surfaces in the bloodlines of European nobility, in cryptic tombstone inscriptions, and architectural anomalies of great cathedrals. It is a whisper that has provoked both fascination and fear. For if true, it represents not just a historical curiosity, but a fundamental challenge to the theological foundations of Christianity's largest institution. If Jesus had children, if his bloodline continued, what would that mean for the Church built upon his divinity? And more importantly, if such descendants exist today, what might the Vatican know about them? What lengths would it go to either protect or suppress this knowledge? The whisper of a bloodline is not merely about genealogy. It is about power, legitimacy, and the very nature of divinity itself. It is a secret that, if true, was worth killing for, worth dying for, and perhaps, most tellingly, worth preserving at all costs. The Vatican archives extend deep beneath the Apostolic Palace, housing over 50 miles of shelving filled with documents spanning more than 8 centuries. Yet this represents only what the Church has chosen to preserve and acknowledge. The true extent of Vatican knowledge remains one of history's most closely guarded mysteries. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched what would become one of the Church's most brutal campaigns, the Albigensian Crusade. The target was not Muslim-held Jerusalem, but Christian communities in southern France. The official justification was to stamp out the Cathar heresy, a dualistic interpretation of Christianity that rejected much of church doctrine. But the Cathars held another belief that troubled Rome far more deeply. They maintained that Mary Magdalene had fled to their region carrying the child of Jesus. and that certain noble families among them were direct descendants of this sacred union. The Pope's command at the siege of Béziers has echoed through centuries. Kill them all. God will know his own. When the smoke cleared, an entire cultural tradition had been virtually erased. Libraries burned, oral histories silenced, bloodlines severed. The region that had most strongly preserved the alternative narrative of Jesus' family was brought firmly under Vatican control. Yet, curiously, even as the Church publicly condemned such beliefs, a different attitude seemed to prevail. Behind closed doors, throughout medieval times, Vatican emissaries maintained close relationships with certain noble houses in Europe. Families with obscure but protected lineages received special dispensations, subtle diplomatic support during conflicts, and immunity from certain religious persecutions. The Vatican's public doctrine and private actions haven't always aligned. There are documented cases where the Church officially condemned certain bloodlines as heretical, while secretly ensuring their protection. The Plantard lineage in France, for instance, maintained curious papal connections despite beliefs that would have been considered heretical in any other family. In the shadowy realm between official history and hidden truth, the Vatican appears to have played a double game, publicly upholding the doctrine of Christ's celibacy while privately acknowledging and even protecting those who might carry his. This paradoxical behavior extends into Renaissance Italy, where the Vatican's involvement with certain families reveals patterns difficult to explain through conventional history. The House of Medici, despite practices that often ran counter to church teachings, maintained extraordinary influence over papal affairs. Several Medici family members became popes, while others directed church policy from behind the scenes. Vatican records reveal an unusual preoccupation with certain bloodlines, tracking marriages and births among select European noble houses with an attention that went beyond typical political concerns. Secret papal bulls, discovered centuries later, granted special status to obscure family lines, while requiring they maintain absolute discretion about their heritage. The pattern becomes even more intriguing when examining Vatican response to threats against these lineages. When Philip IV of France moved against certain noble houses connected to Templar knowledge, Pope Clement V intervened in ways that historical records struggle to explain. While publicly supporting the king's actions, confidential letters reveal the Pope secretly arranged safe passage for specific individuals, people whose names appear in encrypted Vatican documents alongside symbols associated with Magdalene. Devotion. Inside the Vatican's innermost circles, a select group appears to have been tasked with monitoring and protecting certain bloodlines throughout European history. Known in some texts as the Sangreal Guardians, these clerics operated under direct papal authority outside normal church hierarchy. Their communications, written in complex ciphers, reference the sacred vessel and the living chalice, terms scholars believe may refer not to the physical Holy Grail, but to the bloodline itself. The Church's ambiguous relationship with these lineages crystallizes in the story of the enigmatic Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici. During his papacy from 1513 to 1521, he commissioned works that subtly incorporated symbolism connected to Mary Magdalene and sacred bloodlines. His famous quote, "How well we know what a profitable superstition this fable of Christ has been, for us, has been dismissed by church historians as anti-Catholic propaganda. Yet his private correspondence reveals a man grappling with profound secrets about Christianity's origins. The Renaissance popes weren't simply corrupt or worldly, as they're often portrayed. Many were involved in a complex theological balancing act, maintaining public church doctrine while privately acknowledging a more complicated truth. The Medici popes in particular seem to have been initiates into knowledge about sacred bloodlines. This duality, public condemnation and private protection, finds its most dramatic expression in the Vatican's handling of historical evidence. When the Nag Hammadi Library and Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the mid-20th century, the Church showed remarkable interest in controlling access to specific texts. Scholars report unusual delays in publishing certain fragments, particularly those concerning Mary Magdalene's role in early Christianity. More telling still is the Vatican's reaction to bloodline claims throughout history. Rather than dismissing them as mere fantasy, the Church has often responded with precisely calibrated force, enough to discredit public believers while avoiding the kind of attention that would lead to deeper investigation. This surgical approach suggests not the confident rejection of absurdity, but the careful management of dangerous truth. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for Vatican knowledge comes from the Church's own artistic traditions. Renaissance art commissioned by the Vatican contains a complex system of symbolic references to Mary Magdalene and sacred bloodlines. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, painted under church patronage, famously depicts a feminine figure at Christ's right hand, interpreted by some scholars as Mary Magdalene, placed in the position of wife according to Jewish tradition. Throughout Vatican-commissioned art, specific symbols recur: the rose, the chalice, the pregnant woman, the sacred feminine, creating what amounts to a shadow doctrine hidden in plain sight. These artistic elements, approved by church authorities intimately familiar with their symbolism, suggest a Vatican policy of preserving bloodline knowledge through permitted cultural channels, while officially denying its legitimacy. This pattern continues into modern times. When historical researchers approach topics touching on sacred bloodlines, they report curious experiences with Vatican archives, documents temporarily unavailable, permissions suddenly revoked, certain collections permanently closed for restoration. Former Vatican librarians have described special collections accessible only to those with direct papal authorization, containing materials related to Merovingian genealogies and early church history. The Vatican's position as guardian of a secret it officially denies creates a historical paradox that has shaped Western civilization in profound ways. By simultaneously suppressing and preserving bloodline knowledge, the Church has maintained both its theological authority and its connection to Christianity's deepest mysteries. The most effective way to guard a secret isn't to bury it completely, but to shape how it's perceived. By relegating bloodline claims to the realm of conspiracy and fiction, while subtly preserving the actual knowledge, the Vatican has managed a theological impossibility, maintaining Christ's divinity while protecting his human descendants. If the guardians of the secret still operate within Vatican walls, they do so with the weight of 2,000 years of carefully managed history behind them. Their task remains what it has always been: to navigate the narrow path between revelation and concealment, between faith and fact, between the divine Christ of church doctrine and the possible reality of his living descendants. In the mountain village of Rennes-le-Château in southern France, a humble parish priest named Béranger Saunière made a discovery in 1891 that transformed him overnight from impoverished cleric to inexplicably wealthy man. While renovating his ancient church, Saunière found parchments hidden inside a Visigothic pillar, documents that prompted a secret journey to Paris, meetings with esoteric societies, and upon his return, a spending spree that included the construction of a mysterious tower called Tour Magdala. Saunière's sudden wealth baffled his superiors. When questioned, he refused to reveal his source of income, even under the threat of excommunication. He died in 1917, taking his secret to the grave after receiving last rites from a priest who emerged from the confession room visibly shaken. What had Saunière discovered? The answer may lie in the elaborate coded symbolism he incorporated into his church renovation's symbolism connected to Mary Magdalene, sacred bloodlines, and lost genealogies. This obscure village priest's story illuminates a larger pattern. Throughout history, certain documents have surfaced briefly before disappearing into private collections or Vatican vaults. These texts, collectively forming what scholars call the hidden genealogies, present an alternative history of Christianity's most sacred family, the Despacini. Documents represent perhaps the most significant of these suppressed genealogical records. The term Despacini refers to the blood relatives of Jesus, a group explicitly acknowledged in early church writings. According to the church historian Eusebius, the Despacini maintained detailed genealogical records and held special status in the early Christian community until the reign of Emperor Domitian. The early church fathers, including Julius Africanus and Eusebius, openly discussed Jesus' family members and their descendants. It's only later that this aspect of church history becomes obscured. The question is why these family connections, initially acknowledged, became increasingly sensitive information as church power consolidated. In 318 CE, as Constantine was reshaping Christianity into a state religion, representatives of the Despacini reportedly met with Pope Sylvester I, presenting genealogical documents and requesting recognition of their bloodline's special status. According to accounts preserved in Coptic traditions, these representatives were denied, their documents confiscated, and their subsequent fate left unrecorded in official church history. The timing is significant. This meeting occurred shortly before the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, where Christ's divine nature was emphasized over his human aspects. The suppression of family documents may have been necessary to elevate Jesus from Jewish Messiah to divine Son of God in the Greco-Roman tradition Constantine envisioned, yet these genealogies did not vanish entirely. They resurfaced throughout medieval Europe in fragmentary form, preserved by groups operating at the margins of church authority. The Cathars, the Knights Templar, certain Jewish mystics, and later Rosicrucian and Masonic orders all claimed access to genealogical knowledge connecting European noble houses to the family of Jesus. The priory documents, discovered in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris in the 1960s, contained genealogical tables tracing specific noble bloodlines back to the Merovingian kings and beyond, with coded references to Magdalene origins. Though dismissed by mainstream historians as elaborate hoaxes, these parchments contained information about noble family connections that was subsequently verified through independent research. More compelling still are the copper scrolls found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Unlike the other primarily religious texts, these scrolls recorded the locations of hidden treasures and sacred artifacts. Among the items listed are genealogical tables of the sons of the third, a cryptic reference that some scholars connect to third-generation descendants of a significant bloodline. The copper scrolls present a fascinating historical puzzle. They're essentially a treasure map created by a community that had strong connections to early Christianity. Among the items they considered worth preserving and hiding were genealogical records. This suggests these bloodlines held tremendous importance to people who anticipated persecution and took steps to preserve their heritage. Vatican involvement with these genealogical documents becomes apparent when tracing their historical movement. In 1244, during the fall of the Cathar stronghold at Montsegur, 4 Cathar perfecti escaped carrying unknown treasures. Historical records from Vatican sources show Pope Innocent IV dispatched Dominican inquisitors specifically tasked with recovering certain family records rather than religious texts. Similar patterns emerge around the suppression of the Knights Templar. When Philip IV of France moved against the order in 1307, he was particularly interested in obtaining genealogical documents in their possession. Vatican records reveal Pope Clement V negotiated separately for these same documents, eventually securing some materials that went directly to secret papal archives rather than into French royal hands. What makes these hidden genealogies so threatening to established church doctrine is not merely their suggestion that Jesus had children, but the implication that these bloodlines have continued, unbroken, into the present day. If such descendants exist, they would represent a living connection to Christianity's founder that bypasses church authority, a direct bloodline that neither requires nor acknowledges papal legitimacy. The geographical pattern of bloodline protection reveals a consistent Vatican strategy. While publicly supporting efforts to suppress heretical claims about Jesus' family, the Church has often worked behind the scenes to ensure certain lineages remained intact. Special dispensations for consanguineous marriages between blood relatives were granted to specific noble houses, permissions that protected bloodline continuity while requiring absolute Vatican awareness of genealogical connections. Medieval manuscripts contain tantalizing references to these protected lines. The Dauchy's secrets speak of the vine of St. Mary Magdalene growing through select European houses, the red serpent. Bloodline, mentioned in encrypted Vatican correspondence, received unusual diplomatic protection during periods of conflict. The children of Sarah appear in coded communications between certain monastic orders and Vatican officials through the 17th century. Perhaps most significant is the recurring reference to sangreal, a term often translated as Holy Grail, but which literally means royal blood. The semantic wordplay conceals a profound alternative understanding of Christianity's central mystery, that the true Holy Grail is not a physical cup, but a bloodline carrying the divine heritage of Jesus himself. Modern scientific advances have added intriguing dimensions to this historical mystery. Genetic studies of certain Mediterranean and European populations have identified unusual haplogroups, genetic markers that indicate shared ancestry among communities historically connected to early Christian migrations. Areas of southern France, northern Spain, and parts of Scotland show genetic patterns consistent with Middle Eastern ancestry dating to the 1st century CE. DNA analysis has revealed some surprising connections between certain European noble families and Sephardic Jewish populations with ancestral origins in Palestine. While this doesn't prove a connection to Jesus specifically, it does corroborate the historical claim that Middle Eastern bloodlines established themselves in Western Europe during the early Christian period. The Vatican's approach to these genealogical claims has evolved in the modern era. Rather than direct suppression, the Church has employed more sophisticated methods of information management, supporting academic work that discredits bloodline theories, while maintaining extraordinary interest in archaeological discoveries that might contain genealogical information. When the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in 1945, certain texts, particularly the Gospel of Philip with its provocative references to Mary Magdalene, faced unusual publication delays. Scholars working with these materials reported subtle pressure to interpret ambiguous passages in ways that minimized bloodline implications. Similar patterns surrounded the delayed publication of certain Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that contained genealogical information. The Church's contemporary stance on bloodline claims exemplifies its historical duality, public dismissal coupled with private vigilance. Vatican officials publicly characterize such theories as popularized fictions, while maintaining one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence networks for monitoring information about early Christian history. This dualistic approach simultaneously denying and protecting suggests not the behavior of an institution confronting mere fantasy, but one managing a dangerous truth. If these genealogies are purely fictional, why has the Vatican dedicated such resources to controlling them throughout history? Why do papal bulls specifically prohibit discussion of certain noble lineages? Why do church authorities respond to bloodline claims not with the dismissive indifference reserved for obvious fabrications, but with the calculated precision of information warfare? The answer may lie in the profound theological implications of these hidden genealogies. A living bloodline from Jesus would not simply represent a historical curiosity, but a fundamental challenge to church authority. Such descendants would embody a direct connection to Christianity's founder that requires no ecclesiastical mediation, a bloodline inheritance that neither acknowledges nor requires Vatican legitimacy. Yet, paradoxically, if such descendants exist, the Church may be their most important protector. Throughout history, political powers have sought to either control or eliminate such bloodlines for their symbolic power. The Vatican, with its unmatched institutional memory and global reach, may have positioned itself as guardian of a lineage it cannot publicly acknowledge, preserving through centuries what it officially denies. The hidden genealogies thus represent both the Vatican's greatest secret and its most sacred trust. In the space between public doctrine and private knowledge, between the divine Christ of faith and the human Jesus of history, lies a mystery that continues to shape the relationship between the Church and the bloodlines it may have spent 2 millennia both suppressing and protecting. The year 1244 marked a turning point in the shadow history of Europe. As flames consumed the Cathar stronghold of Montségur in southern France, four figures slipped away under cover of darkness. They carried with them what surviving accounts describe only as the treasure, not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable. Documents and artifacts connected to a bloodline the Church could neither acknowledge nor allow to be destroyed. These four escaped into the mist of history, but the lineage they protected continued to surface throughout Europe in the centuries that followed, appearing in unexpected places, moving through history like a subterranean river, hidden, powerful, and impossible to contain completely. The first clear traces emerge in the Languedoc region of France, where certain noble families maintained curious traditions at odds with Orthodox Christianity. They practiced rituals honoring Mary Magdalene that went far beyond the standard veneration of saints. Their private chapels contained encoded symbolism: the rose, the chalice, the pregnant woman, motifs that scholars now recognize as references to sacred bloodlines. Most tellingly, these families kept detailed genealogical records that they guarded more fiercely than any material treasure. When persecution came, these families did not fight as conventional nobles would for land or wealth. Instead, they scattered, taking new names, abandoning castles and titles, but always preserving two things: their bloodline connections through strategic marriages and their private records of descent. The pattern becomes clear when you study certain European families across generations. They would seemingly sacrifice everything: wealth, lands, titles, but would go to extraordinary lengths to maintain specific marital alliances. This behavior makes little political or economic sense unless they were protecting something they valued more than conventional power: a sacred heritage. By the 15th century, these descendants had adopted a strategy of hiding in plain sight. No longer concentrated in southern France, they had dispersed across Europe, integrating into various noble houses while maintaining hidden connections. The Sinclair family in Scotland, the Plantards in France, branches of the Habsburg dynasty, certain Italian noble houses, all show patterns consistent with bloodline preservation. The architecture they left behind speaks in a symbolic language. To those who know how to read it, Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built by the Sinclair family in the mid-15th century, contains imagery that connects Templar symbolism with references to Mary Magdalene and sacred bloodlines. The chapel's famous apprentice pillar has been interpreted as a representation of the family tree descending from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, with intricate carvings that trace a lineage down through the centuries. That similar architectural messages appear in churches and noble residences across Europe. Hidden in plain sight, these symbols formed a communication network for those who carried this secret heritage. A rose window here, a specific arrangement of biblical figures there, to initiated eyes. These elements revealed safe havens and allied families committed to protecting the bloodline. These descendants developed extraordinary adaptive strategies. During the Inquisition, when genealogical investigations could prove fatal, they embedded their family histories in allegorical talis and heraldic symbols. The recurring imagery of the lion, the bear, and the unicorn in certain family crests served as coded references to bloodline connections. Wedding traditions among these families included private rituals and exchanges of genealogical information that remained separate from the public Christian ceremonies. The bloodline's survival required constant vigilance and strategic planning. Marriages were carefully arranged to maintain genetic connections while avoiding the dangerous visibility of obvious consanguinity. Children were educated in secret histories alongside their conventional studies. Family members served in key positions as royal advisors, Vatican diplomats, banking powers, creating a protective network around the core bloodlines. What's remarkable is how these families maintained their cohesion across centuries without any official organization. They operated through marital alliances, godparent relationships, and business partnerships that disguised deeper connections. They developed methods to recognize one another through specific phrases, symbols, and behavioral patterns that would be meaningless to outsiders. The Medici family of Florence exemplifies this strategy of hidden influence, rising from obscurity to become one of Renaissance Europe's most powerful dynasties. The Medici maintained unusual relationships with both secular and religious authorities. Their banking empire gave them leverage over cash-strapped monarchs and popes, while their patronage of art allowed them to preserve bloodline symbolism and cultural masterpieces that still adorn Europe's greatest museums and churches. When Lorenzo de' Medici arranged for his son Giovanni to become Pope Leo X, he placed someone with knowledge of the sacred bloodlines at the very heart of the institution, officially dedicated to denying their existence. This paradoxical strategy, infiltrating power structures rather than opposing them, became the hallmark of bloodline preservation. This approach reached its apotheosis in the complex figure of Nicolas Flamel, the 14th century French scribe and alchemist. Conventional history records Flamel as an alchemist who claimed to have discovered the philosopher's stone. What fewer historians note is his extensive work with genealogical documents and his connections to families linked to bloodline traditions. His legendary ability to transform base metals into gold serves as a perfect metaphor for the true work of these lineages, transforming dangerous knowledge into protected wisdom that could survive through centuries. The bloodline's journey through Europe follows distinctive patterns when mapped historically. From southern France, branches spread into northern Spain, particularly Catalonia and the Basque regions, areas that maintained unusual autonomy and distinctive religious practices. Throughout the medieval period, other branches moved into Scotland, especially after the suppression of the Knights Templar, finding protection among Highland clans with pre-Christian traditions that made them receptive to alternative religious narratives. Northern Italy became another center, with Venice and Florence hosting families connected to the bloodlines. The Republic of Venice, with its complex political system designed to prevent any single family from dominating, provided ideal conditions for bloodline families to operate with relative freedom while maintaining strict privacy. The city's position as a crossroads between East and West also allowed for communication with distant branches of the family in Byzantine and later Ottoman territories. These geographical dispersions weren't random but followed careful strategic logic. Bloodline families settled in regions with certain common characteristics, areas with traditions of independence from central authority, places where diverse religious traditions coexisted, centers of learning and artistic expression where symbolic communication could flourish. and regions with natural geographic protection, such as mountains or islands. These families didn't just survive by hiding. They developed sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting their heritage. They created educational approaches that trained children to recognize symbolic patterns. They developed memory techniques that allowed oral transmission of genealogical information that wouldn't appear in written records vulnerable to seizure. They established private libraries with works in coded language that could pass as conventional literature to uninitiated eyes. Perhaps most ingeniously, they infiltrated the very institutions most dedicated to suppressing them. Bloodline members entered monasteries and convents, rose through church hierarchies, took positions as royal tutors and advisors. Rather than opposing power, they worked within it, gently influencing decisions that affected their survival, while never revealing their true identity or purpose. This strategy of invisible influence explains why direct evidence of the bloodline remains elusive. These were families who perfected the art of operating in history's blind spots, of existing in the negative spaces of official records. Their success depended on remaining undetected while maintaining the knowledge of their heritage across generations. The pattern becomes especially clear during periods of religious persecution. During the Spanish Inquisition, certain families fled Spain not for the obvious sanctuaries in Protestant lands, but for specific Catholic territories where they had ancient alliances. Their escape routes, documented in private family papers discovered centuries later, reveal not random flight, but movement along predetermined paths to communities prepared to receive them. The bloodlines. Survival strategy evolved with the changing political landscape of Europe. As nation-states consolidated power and improved record-keeping made anonymity more difficult, these families adapted again. They became pioneers in international finance, creating systems for moving assets across borders beyond the reach of any single authority. They established educational institutions where their traditions could be preserved under the guise of classical learning. They developed new layers of symbolic communication through art, music, and literature. By the 18th century, with the rise of Enlightenment thinking and revolutionary politics, the bloodline families faced new challenges and opportunities. Some aligned themselves with Masonic lodges and similar organizations that preserved esoteric knowledge within seemingly conventional fraternal structures. Others established salons and intellectual circles where alternative historical narratives could be explored under the protection of scholarly inquiry. The French Revolution represented both crisis and opportunity. The violent upheaval threatened ancient noble families connected to the bloodlines, but the revolution's anti-clerical aspects also weakened the Church's power to suppress alternative religious narratives. In this chaotic environment, certain families strategically lost their noble titles while preserving their wealth and influence in new commercial ventures suited to the emerging industrial age. Throughout these adaptations, the core purpose remained unchanged: to preserve not just a genealogical connection, but a living tradition that represented an alternative understanding of Christianity's origins, a tradition centered not on institutional authority, but on direct bloodline connection to its founder. What these families preserved wasn't simply a claim to famous ancestry. They maintained a complete alternative understanding of Christianity, one that honored the divine feminine through Mary Magdalene, that saw Jesus as both divine and fully human, that recognized sacred lineage as a living connection rather than abstract theology. This wasn't just genealogy. It was a complete spiritual worldview preserved within family traditions. As Europe moved into the modern era, these lost children of Christendom became increasingly sophisticated in their methods of preservation and protection. They no longer needed to hide from burning stakes or inquisitorial chambers, but the fundamental challenge remained: how to preserve a truth at odds with official history, how to maintain bloodlines connected to the most controversial heritage in Western civilization. Their story continues in the quiet corners of European society, in families that maintain unusual traditions, in private libraries with books that tell coded histories, in the subtle symbolism of art commissioned for seemingly conventional purposes. The lost children of Christendom never truly disappeared. They simply learned to exist in the shadows cast by history's official light. The spring of 1497 brought Pope Alexander VI to a momentous decision. Standing in his private chambers in the Vatican, the Borgia Pope examined documents recovered from Florence following the fall of the Medici. Among these papers were genealogical records connecting several prominent Italian families to bloodlines officially deemed heretical. With political instability threatening the papal states and his own position, Alexander faced a choice that would establish a pattern for centuries to come. He did not destroy these documents. Instead, he ordered the construction of a special archive beneath the Vatican, accessible only through his private chambers. The records disappeared from history's public view, but remained preserved in the Church's most secure repository. This moment exemplifies the complex relationship between the Vatican and the bloodline it could neither acknowledge nor allow to be lost. A relationship defined by power and silence. Throughout church history, certain popes have taken extraordinary measures regarding information about Jesus' potential descendants. These actions follow a consistent pattern: public condemnation coupled with private preservation. The most dramatic example comes from the papacy of Innocent III, who launched the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars, while simultaneously issuing secret directives to preserve specific genealogical records from destruction. When you examine papal bulls and private correspondence side by side, a fascinating pattern emerges. The same pope who publicly denounced bloodline claims would often take elaborate measures to obtain and secure the very documents supporting those claims. This isn't the behavior of someone suppressing fiction. It's the action of someone managing dangerous truth. The Vatican's approach crystallized around three principles that have guided its actions for centuries. First, bloodline information must never be destroyed, as it might be needed for verification in future crises. Second, this information must never become public, as it would undermine church authority. Third, actual bloodline descendants must be monitored but not eliminated, as they might serve essential purposes in God's plan that the Church could not fully comprehend. This theological ambivalence created a practical policy of containment rather than eradication. Throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe, Vatican representatives maintained secret communication with certain noble houses connected to bloodline traditions. These relationships operated through coded correspondence, private audiences, and designated intermediaries with carefully limited knowledge. The most visible manifestation of this policy appears in the Vatican's treatment of the Knights Templar. The historical record shows Pope Clement V initially protected the order against King Philip IV's accusations. Only when Philip threatened to publicize information about Christ's bloodline did Clement reverse course, sacrificing the Templars while negotiating for the surrender of specific documents that went directly into papal vaults rather than French. Royal archives. Similar patterns emerge around the Vatican's handling of Renaissance banking families. The Church maintained complex financial relationships with houses like the Medici and later the Rothschilds, families historically connected to bloodline preservation. These financial entanglements created mutual dependencies that ensured both church secrets and family bloodlines remained protected. The relationship between the Vatican and these banking dynasties went far beyond economics. These arrangements allowed the Church to monitor bloodline families while giving those families leverage to ensure their own protection. It was a delicate balance of power sustained through shared secrets and mutual vulnerability. Perhaps the most telling evidence of Vatican knowledge comes from its management of specific properties throughout Europe. Certain lands connected to early Magdalene traditions received special status under church law. The region around Rennes-le-Château in southern France, sites in Provence associated with Mary Magdalene's supposed arrival in Europe, specific properties in Venice and Florence, all enjoyed unusual autonomy and protection, even during periods of aggressive Vatican centralization. The Church's treatment of female monastic orders provides another window into this hidden history. Convents historically connected to Magdalene devotion operated under regulations distinct from standard church governance. These communities maintained private libraries, conducted independent scholarly activities, and preserved traditions honoring the sacred feminine that sometimes bordered on heterodoxy. Yet they received protection from the highest levels of church hierarchy. This pattern of controlled preservation extended to the Vatican's management of historical texts. When the Church suppressed heretical writings, certain documents followed a different path than public bonfires. Texts containing genealogical information or references to Jesus' family life were systematically removed to specialized Vatican collections. While officially condemned, they were meticulously preserved and studied by scholars, operating under direct papal authority. The most dramatic example of power and silence converged around the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, which established key Catholic doctrines in response to Protestant challenges. Behind the Council's public theological deliberations, a parallel process occurred involving genealogical documents recovered during military campaigns in France and Germany. These records were evaluated by a special commission reporting directly to Pope Paul III, resulting in new security protocols for bloodline information. The Council of Trent publicly reinforced traditional teachings about Jesus' nature while privately establishing new systems for managing information about his possible descendants. This dual approach, theological assertion coupled with historical containment, became the template for church handling of bloodline questions into the modern era. As European nationalism rose in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Vatican faced new challenges to its information control. Revolutionary governments seized church properties, exposing archives to secular authorities. The Vatican responded by developing more sophisticated methods of information management, dispersing sensitive collections, creating decoy documents, and establishing new coding systems for genealogical records. Napoleon Bonaparte's complex relationship with the Vatican illustrates this evolution. After French forces occupied Rome in 1798, Napoleon gained access to certain Vatican archives. His subsequent actions, establishing special protection for specific noble families, creating a new legal framework for family records, even altering his own imperial symbolism to incorporate elements associated with bloodline traditions, suggest exposure to information that transformed his understanding of European history. The modern era brought new threats and opportunities for the Vatican's management of bloodline information. The rise of professional historical scholarship, archaeology, and eventually genetic science created unprecedented challenges to information control. The Church responded by developing sophisticated academic approaches, supporting historical interpretations that undermined bloodline claims while maintaining extraordinary interest in research touching on Jesus' family connections. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, the Vatican moved quickly to ensure involvement in the scholarly teams studying these ancient texts. Church authorities showed particular interest in scroll fragments containing genealogical information and references to messianic bloodlines. Similar patterns surrounded the Vatican's response to the Nag Hammadi discovery in Egypt, with church representatives focusing specifically on texts discussing Mary Magdalene's relationship with Jesus. The Vatican's approach to archaeological discoveries follows a consistent pattern. Initial enthusiasm supports involvement in research, followed by influence over interpretive frameworks, culminating in careful management of public narratives about findings. This isn't religious interference with scholarship. It's a sophisticated information operation refined over centuries. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the Church's relationship with bloodline information comes from its treatment of specific historical figures who threaten to expose these secrets. From medieval heretics to Renaissance scholars to modern researchers, those who approach too close to bloodline truths have experienced consistent patterns of response, not crude suppression, but subtle delegitimization. Rather than creating martyrs through direct persecution, the Church developed methods to undermine credibility, question motivations, and redirect attention. Researchers who pursued bloodline investigations found academic positions mysteriously withdrawn, publishing opportunities disappearing, and their work subjected to unusually rigorous criticism focused more on their methodology than their actual findings. This approach reached its apotheosis in the Vatican's response to modern popular works, exploring sacred bloodline theories. Rather than dignifying these claims with official refutation, the Church delegated responses to affiliated scholars, who dismissed such ideas as sensationalism without addressing the specific historical evidence. This strategy of intellectual privacy containment effectively marginalized bloodline theories without actually engaging their core historical questions. Within the Vatican itself, knowledge of bloodline matters remains compartmentalized through an elaborate system of access restrictions. Certain Vatican collections require special permission granted only by direct papal authority. Documents in These collections are subject to specialized handling protocols that prevent unauthorized copying or removal. Most significantly, these materials are excluded from the Vatican's otherwise comprehensive digitization efforts, ensuring they remain accessible only through physical presence in carefully monitored spaces. The Vatican's information security system around certain historical materials goes far beyond normal archival procedures. Documents touching on bloodline matters are subject to controls, more commonly associated with state intelligence agencies than religious institutions. This level of security makes little sense unless the information poses genuine risks to established theological narratives. The most compelling evidence for Vatican knowledge comes from the Church's own inconsistent theological positions regarding Jesus' family. While officially maintaining that Jesus had no children, the Church has carefully avoided making this position an infallible dogma, a designation it has assigned to far less significant matters. This theological restraint gives the Church crucial flexibility should historical evidence ever force acknowledgement of bloodline realities. Similar theological ambivalence surrounds Church teachings on Mary Magdalene. Her status has fluctuated dramatically throughout history, from apostle to prostitute to recently rehabilitated saint. These shifts reflect not theological development, but information management, adjusting her public image based on how much bloodline knowledge circulates in the broader culture. At different historical moments, the power dynamics between the Vatican and potential bloodline descendants crystallized in the modern era around specific noble families who maintain unusual relationships with the Church. These families receive diplomatic privileges beyond standard protocols, hold rare perpetual dispensations regarding certain religious obligations, and maintain private communication channels with Vatican officers not available to other Catholic nobility. These special relationships make sense only if these families possess leverage based on shared historical knowledge. The Church treats them not as ordinary noble houses, but as partners in managing a historical legacy too complex for simple public disclosure. In the shadowy realm where power meets silence, the Vatican has maintained a delicate balance for centuries, acknowledging enough about Jesus' humanity to maintain theological credibility while suppressing specific information about his family life that might undermine Church authority. This balance requires constant adjustment as historical knowledge evolves, creating a dynamic relationship between official doctrine and suppressed history. The greatest irony in this centuries-long dance of power and silence may be that the Vatican itself has become the primary protector of the very bloodline information it officially denies. By centralizing these records, preventing their destruction by more radical elements within and outside the Church, and maintaining the world's most sophisticated system for historical preservation, the Vatican has ensured that if evidence of Jesus' descendants ever emerges fully into historical light, it will likely come from the very institution that has denied their existence. 70 feet beneath the Vatican's Belvedere courtyard, beyond the tourist-accessible portions of the Vatican archives, lies a repository known to only a handful of Church officials. This chamber reached through a series of descending corridors, requiring multiple security clearances, houses documents so sensitive that their very existence remains officially unacknowledged. Among these materials are what Vatican insiders have discreetly referred to as the genealogies, records tracking certain bloodlines across 2 millennia of European history. The journey into the deepest vaults of Vatican secrecy begins with understanding the physical reality beneath Rome itself. The city sits atop a honeycomb of ancient structures, catacombs, crypts, forgotten temples, and passageways that connect in unexpected ways. This subterranean Rome has allowed the Church to develop storage systems for sensitive materials that exist literally beneath the level of public accessibility or historical awareness. The Vatican's underground spaces aren't simply storage facilities. They represent a physical manifestation of the Church's approach to history itself, with public narratives maintained at street level while deeper truths rest in chambers below, accessible only to those with the authority and knowledge to navigate these symbolic depths. The architectural evolution of these spaces reveals a pattern of increasingly sophisticated security. The earliest repositories, dating to the 4th century, were simple sealed chambers within existing Roman structures. By medieval times, specialized vaults had been constructed with features designed specifically for document preservation, controlled humidity, protection from vermin and fire, and multiple lock systems requiring different key holders to act in concert for access. Renaissance popes dramatically expanded these facilities, with Sixtus IV and Alexander VI creating new underground chambers connected to their private apartments. These spaces bypassed normal Vatican administrative channels, allowing popes to access and manage sensitive documents without involving the Church bureaucracy. The physical layout ensured that even Vatican officials with access to standard archives remained unaware of these deeper collections. Modern security renovations, implemented during the 20th century and accelerated after World War II, transformed these historical spaces into a state-of-the-art archival system. Climate controls, specialized containment units for fragile materials, advanced fire suppression, and electronic monitoring created preservation conditions rivaling the world's most sophisticated research libraries, all hidden beneath centuries of architectural accumulation. What these vaults contain represents the Vatican's most closely guarded historical treasure. According to accounts from former Vatican employees, religious scholars granted unusual access, and church officials speaking anonymously. The materials fall into several distinct categories, each illuminating different aspects of the bloodline. Mystery. The Magdalene codices represent perhaps the most controversial collection. These texts, dating from the 2nd to 4th centuries, contain accounts of Mary Magdalene's life after the crucifixion, including detailed references to children born to her in the years following Jesus' death, written in Coptic, Greek, and early Latin. These manuscripts were reportedly recovered during the 4th century from Christian communities in southern France and northern Egypt. These codices weren't publicly destroyed as heretical because they contained, too much authentic historical material intertwined with their theological claims. Destroying them would mean losing valuable historical context about early Christianity. So instead, they were preserved but isolated, studied by specialized scholars who operated under direct papal authority rather than through normal church academic channels. The Despacini records form another crucial collection. The term Despacini Literally belonging to the Lord refers to the acknowledged blood relatives of Jesus, whose existence is documented in early church writings. These records trace the movements of Jesus' family members through the first several centuries of Christianity, documenting their presence in communities across the Mediterranean and eventually into Western Europe. Most significantly, these records contain detailed genealogical tables showing family connections that extend beyond the commonly acknowledged relatives. Jesus' brothers James, Joses, Simon, and Judas, mentioned in the Gospels to include descendants through subsequent generations. The collection includes correspondence between early church leaders, debating how to address these family members' special status and claims to authority based on bloodline connection to Jesus. The Templar confiscations represent materials seized during the suppression of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. While most attention focuses on Templar financial records and religious relics, the most sensitive materials recovered during their fall were genealogical documents connecting European noble houses to Middle Eastern bloodlines entering Europe during the early Christian period. These records, originally stored in the Templar Paris Temple, were transferred to direct papal control rather than being publicly destroyed as heretical. They include maps showing the movement of specific families across Europe, symbolic systems for recognizing bloodline connections, and ritual practices designed to preserve family knowledge across generations even during periods of persecution. Perhaps most remarkably, the vaults reportedly contain the Sangreal tables, genealogical records maintained continuously from the medieval period to the present day, tracking bloodline descendants through their complex movements across European history. These tables, updated by each generation of specialized Vatican archivists, represent the most comprehensive documentation of how certain lineages connect to early Christian origins. The Sangreal tables aren't simply historical documents. They're actively maintained genealogical records. Each pope appoints specific individuals responsible for updating these records as births, marriages, and deaths occur in families connected to the bloodlines. This isn't archiving history. It's tracking a living reality the Church officially denies but privately documents with extraordinary precision. The physical organization of these materials within the vaults reflects theological tensions within the Church itself. Documents are categorized not only by time period and language, but by theological sensitivity, with materials challenging core Church doctrines maintained in specialized sections with additional access restrictions. This creates a graduated system of secrecy even within the already restricted vault environment. Access to these collections follows protocols unlike any other Vatican procedure. Unlike standard archives available to qualified scholars, these materials require direct papal authorization. Researchers permitted to view them undergo specialized vetting, including theological examinations and character assessments. Most crucially, they operate under exceptional confidentiality agreements that include provisions for lifelong monitoring by Vatican security services. Those granted access report extraordinary handling procedures. Documents cannot be directly touched, but must be manipulated using specialized tools provided by Vatican archivists. No recording devices or personal notes are permitted. All reading occurs under direct observation, with multiple officials present during document consultation. Most restrictively, no comprehensive examination of complete collections is allowed. Researchers receive access only to specific documents directly relevant to their Vatican-approved research questions. The historical record contains tantalizing glimpses of how these materials have influenced church actions. During periods of European conflict that threatened document preservation, the Vatican undertook extraordinary measures to protect these specific collections. During Napoleon's occupation of Rome, while many church treasures were seized or destroyed, certain archives were evacuated through a pre-established protocol that had been developed specifically for these sensitive materials. Similar emergency preservations occurred during both world wars. As Allied and Axis forces approached Rome, specific Vatican collections were relocated to secure locations through operations coordinated at the highest levels of church leadership. These actions, documented in diplomatic communications intercepted by wartime intelligence services, focus specifically on genealogical materials rather than more famous art treasures or religious relics. The Vatican's emergency preservation protocols reveal its true priorities. When facing existential threats, the Church has consistently prioritized protecting specific historical records over more valuable artistic or financial assets. This behavior only makes sense if these documents hold extraordinary importance to the Church's understanding of its own history and legitimacy. The management of these vaults has evolved alongside changes in information technology. As digital preservation became standard archival practice, the Vatican developed specialized systems for these sensitive collections. Unlike other church records being systematically digitized for broader access, these materials remain deliberately isolated from digital networks, preserved through enhanced analog methods supplemented by standalone digital systems with no external connectivity. This physical and digital isolation serves multiple purposes beyond security. It maintains direct papal control over access, prevents unauthorized copying or distribution, and most significantly, keeps these materials outside normal scholarly discourse. By preserving them in analog form within physically isolated spaces, the Church ensures these documents cannot enter academic circulation through the increasingly porous boundaries of digital archives. The vault system's most remarkable feature may be its continuous operation across centuries of church history. Despite wars, revolutions, changes in theological emphasis, and technological transformation, the basic function remains unchanged: to preserve information too dangerous to destroy, but too challenging to acknowledge publicly. This institutional persistence across radically different historical contexts suggests not a temporary information management challenge, but a permanent structural necessity for the Church. What makes these vaults so crucial to understanding the bloodline mystery is not simply what they contain, but how the Church has maintained them. The extraordinary resources dedicated to preserving these materials, specialized facilities, dedicated personnel, elaborate security systems, emergency protocols, represent an institutional commitment far beyond normal archival practice. This level of investment only makes sense if the materials possess genuine historical significance with profound theological implications. The Vatican's behavior regarding these collections displays a pattern consistent with an institution preserving uncomfortable truth rather than suppressing fiction. Fiction requires no climate-controlled vaults, no specialized handling protocols, no emergency evacuation plans. The Church preserves these materials with the care one devotes not to debunking myths, but to managing dangerous realities. The modern Church has developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to managing these historical materials. In an age of information transparency, Vatican specialists now train in both theological disciplines and advanced archival science, creating a corps of scholar guardians with the technical expertise to preserve ancient documents and the theological background to understand their sensitive implications. Parallel to these preservation efforts, the Church maintains what amounts to an institutional counterhistory, an alternative understanding of Christianity's origins, known only to initiates operating at the highest levels of Vatican authority. This shadow history doesn't contradict official doctrine so much as contextualize it within a more complex historical reality that acknowledges bloodline elements that cannot be publicly incorporated into Church teaching. This dual knowledge system, public theology alongside private historical awareness, creates the distinctive pattern of Vatican behavior regarding bloodline questions. It explains why the Church responds to bloodline claims, not with the dismissive confidence of an institution confronting obvious falsehood, but with the careful precision of an organization managing partial disclosure of complicated truth. Vaults beneath Rome thus represent not simply physical spaces but symbolic repositories of an alternative history of Christianity, one that includes the human family of its founder alongside his divine nature, that acknowledges the legitimate bloodline descendants who have moved through European history like a subterranean river, surfacing occasionally before disappearing again beneath official narratives. What lies beneath the Vatican isn't just parchment and paper, but a different understanding of Christianity itself, one that reconciles the divine Christ of faith with the human Jesus of history. These aren't simply archives. They're the physical embodiment of the Church's most profound theological paradox. In these shadowy chambers, the physical reality of historical evidence meets the metaphysical questions of faith and legitimacy. The vaults preserve not just ancient documents, but living questions that continue to shape the relationship between the Vatican and the bloodlines it has spent 2 millennia both suppressing and protecting. For if these records do indeed exist, in the chambers beneath Rome, they represent the ultimate historical irony that the institution most publicly committed to denying Jesus' bloodline descendants may also be their most dedicated chronicler, and perhaps, in its own paradoxical way, their most faithful guardian. In 1883, Claude Debussy completed a remarkable composition that would never appear in his official catalogue of works. This piece, performed only in private gatherings of the Priory of Sion, contained musical phrases structured around Fibonacci, sequences and golden ratios, mathematical patterns associated with bloodline symbolism. The composition included subtle musical quotations from Gregorian chants connected to Mary Magdalene devotion. Debussy, like many artists throughout history, had become a vessel for transmitting secret knowledge through cultural channels beyond the reach of religious or political censorship. This underground cultural transmission represents one of the most fascinating aspects of the bloodline mystery, how it transformed from guarded genealogical knowledge into a living symbolic tradition expressed through art, architecture, literature, and music. As physical persecution of bloodline bearers became less feasible in the modern era, the battleground shifted to cultural narratives and symbolic representation. The bloodline story became both more hidden and more visible, encoded in works consumed by millions who remained unaware of the secret knowledge they were absorbing. Renaissance art provides the most vivid examples of this encoded transmission. Leonardo da Vinci's works contain some of the most sophisticated systems of bloodline symbolism ever created. His Last Supper has drawn attention for the feminine appearance of the figure at Jesus' right hand, interpreted by some scholars as Mary Magdalene rather than the Apostle John. Less obvious are the mathematical relationships embedded in the composition, the arranged hand positions that create specific geometric patterns, and the architectural details that reference sacred geometry associated with bloodline traditions. Da Vinci wasn't simply hiding symbols in his paintings. He was creating entire systems of visual communication that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Casual viewers saw biblical scenes, while initiated observers recognized patterns that connected to specific genealogical knowledge. This layered communication allowed bloodline information to hide in plain sight, preserved in works too culturally valuable to censor or destroy. Similar encoding appears in architecture throughout Europe. The great cathedrals, officially celebrating Orthodox Christianity, contain unmistakable elements of alternative spiritual traditions connected to bloodline beliefs. Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres Cathedral, and countless smaller churches incorporate symbolic references to the sacred feminine, the union of divine and human bloodlines, and the geometric patterns associated with genealogical continuity. These architectural expressions often focus on specific mathematical relationships derived from natural patterns of growth and reproduction, the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, the Vesica Piscis. These same mathematical relationships appear in family trees of certain European noble houses, creating resonances between natural growth patterns, sacred architecture, and bloodline genealogies that would be recognizable only to those with specialized knowledge. The transmission of bloodline knowledge evolved further through the emergence of formal and informal societies dedicated to preserving esoteric traditions. The Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Martinists, Theosophists, and numerous smaller groups incorporated elements of bloodline symbolism into their rituals and teachings. While most members engaged with these symbols at a purely philosophical level, inner circles maintained awareness of their connection to actual genealogical claims. These societies functioned as cultural bomb shelters, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost during periods of religious or political persecution. Their hierarchical structure, with teachings revealed gradually as members advanced through degrees, created perfect vehicles for maintaining sensitive information within a larger organization, primarily focused on moral philosophy and fraternal bonding. The Knights Templar exemplify this approach to preservation through organizational structure. While publicly dedicated to protecting pilgrims and fighting in the Crusades, their inner organizational structure maintains specialized knowledge accessible only to highest-ranking members. After their suppression, Templar knowledge diffused into other organizations, particularly Freemasonry, which incorporated Templar symbols and rituals that continued bloodline traditions under new institutional frameworks. This pattern of institutional preservation through transformation appears consistently throughout European history. When one organization faced suppression, key members would transfer bloodline knowledge to new vehicles better suited to current cultural conditions. This adaptive strategy allowed bloodline traditions to survive periods of intense persecution by changing their external form while maintaining internal continuity. Literature provided another powerful vehicle for bloodline preservation. From medieval troubadour traditions to modern novels, the bloodline story found expression in narratives that could be interpreted either as pure fiction or as coded references to historical reality. The Grail romances of Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach contain some of the most explicit early references, presenting the Grail not primarily as a cup, but as a stone or object inscribed with family lineages. These literary traditions developed specialized vocabulary and symbolic systems that communicated bloodline concepts to initiated readers while appearing as mere fantasy to others. Terms like Sangreal, interpreted both as Holy Grail and royal blood, the rose and the cross, the widow's son, and the lost word functioned as triggers that activated deeper levels of understanding for those with preparatory knowledge. What makes these literary codes so effective is their plausible deniability. The same text can be simultaneously a charming romantic tale and a sophisticated vehicle for transmitting forbidden knowledge. This dual functioning allowed bloodline information to move through mainstream cultural channels without triggering the censorship that would have greeted more explicit claims. Music developed its own systems for encoding bloodline knowledge. Certain compositional structures, particularly those involving mathematics of harmony and specific key relationships, became associated with bloodline traditions. Bach's compositions contain mathematical patterns and numerological references connected to esoteric traditions, preserving bloodline knowledge. Mozart's involvement with Masonic traditions led to works like the Magic Flute that incorporates symbolic systems with roots in bloodline preservation. These artistic transmissions weren't merely abstract symbolism but connected to actual protection of bloodline descendants. Artistic patrons connected to bloodline families sponsored works that preserved their traditions while providing cultural legitimacy and protection to artists who served as knowledge bearers. This created mutually beneficial relationships that maintained bloodline knowledge within mainstream cultural expressions. The encoding process reached unprecedented sophistication in the modern era as bloodline symbolism entered mass media and popular culture. Films, novels, and visual art incorporated elements of bloodline traditions, often transformed through multiple interpretative layers that maintained essential concepts while adapting to contemporary cultural frameworks. What began as guarded genealogical knowledge evolved into cultural mythology with persistent core elements recognizable across diverse expressions. The transition from closely guarded secret to cultural mythology represents not a dilution, but an evolution in preservation. Strategy. By allowing bloodline concepts to enter popular imagination as speculative fiction, their guardians created the perfect cover for actual historical truth, hiding reality within a cloud of similar-seeming fantasy. that discourages serious historical investigation. This strategy proved remarkably effective when bloodline claims attracted renewed attention in the late 20th century. Books exploring historical evidence for Jesus' descendants found enthusiastic audiences but struggled to gain academic legitimacy precisely because the topic had been so thoroughly associated with speculative fiction. The bloodline's cultural encoding had created its own protective mechanism, the assumption that such claims belonged to the realm of imagination rather than history. Yet beneath popular representations, more serious preservation continued through scholarly and initiatory channels. Academic disciplines like art history, musicology, literary criticism, and architectural analysis maintained specialized subcommunities focused on esoteric symbolism and its historical meaning. These scholarly networks, operating within legitimate academic frameworks, preserved more precise knowledge about bloodline traditions and their historical expressions. Initiatory societies continued this work through increasingly sophisticated organizational structures adapted to modern conditions, no longer requiring the secrecy of earlier periods. These groups operated openly as philosophical organizations while maintaining inner teachings accessible through progressive stages of instruction. Their public educational function provided perfect cover for more sensitive historical preservation. The digital age transformed bloodline preservation yet again. Information that once required personal transmission through trusted relationships became accessible through specialized websites, encrypted communications, and digital archives. This democratization of access created new challenges for discernment between genuine historical knowledge and creative elaboration, but also ensured that bloodline information could never again be completely suppressed through destruction of physical records or elimination of knowledge bearers. The Internet created both risk and opportunity for bloodline traditions. The risk comes from dilution and distortion as information circulates without traditional contextual frameworks. The opportunity lies in creating preservation systems, too, distributed to be effectively suppressed. The bloodline story now exists across thousands of servers worldwide, in forms ranging from scholarly analysis to creative interpretation. Throughout these evolutions in preservation strategy, certain noble families maintained more direct connection to bloodline knowledge. These families, many still prominent in European society, preserve private traditions, maintain specialized libraries, and continue dynastic practices designed to protect bloodline continuity. Their public profiles give no indication of these private commitments, creating the perfect contemporary cover for ongoing bloodline preservation. The Vatican's relationship with these cultural transmissions reveals the same paradoxical approach, visible in its handling of historical documents. Church authorities publicly dismiss artistic and literary bloodline references as imaginative fantasy, while maintaining extraordinary scholarly interest in the same works. Vatican art historians, musicologists, and literary scholars devote careers to analyzing precisely the symbolic systems most connected to bloodline traditions. This dual approach, public dismissal coupled with private study, extends to the Vatican's handling of contemporary cultural expressions of bloodline themes. When books, films, or other media exploring bloodline possibilities gain popular attention, The Church responds with carefully calibrated statements that redirect attention without directly engaging historical evidence. This strategy focuses on theological objections rather than historical refutation, sidestepping questions about actual genealogical possibility. The Vatican's response to cultural expressions of bloodline themes follows a consistent pattern, addressing theological implications while avoiding direct engagement with historical evidence. This approach neither confirms nor decisively refutes bloodline possibilities, maintaining the ambiguity that has characterized church handling of this question throughout history. The bloodline's cultural legacy extends beyond specific artistic works to broader conceptual frameworks that have shaped Western intellectual tradition. The integration of divine and human elements, the recognition of sacred feminine principles, alongside masculine divinity, the understanding of spiritual authority as flowing through bloodline connection rather than institutional appointment. These concepts permeate Western esoteric traditions with far-reaching cultural influence. This conceptual legacy challenges fundamental assumptions about religious authority and spiritual legitimacy. If divine presence flows through bloodline connection rather than institutional ordination, traditional power structures lose their exclusive claim to religious authority. This radical implication explains why bloodline claims have faced such consistent suppression despite, or perhaps because of, their potential historical validity. The secret legacy of the bloodline thus operates simultaneously across multiple dimensions in actual genealogical descent preserved through strategic marriages and family records, in cultural encoding through artistic and literary works, in conceptual frameworks maintained by philosophical and initiatory traditions, and in institutional memory preserved within specialized Vatican departments and other religious organizations. This multi-layered preservation ensures that the bloodline story cannot be eliminated through any single mechanism of suppression. It has become too deeply integrated into Western cultural DNA, expressing itself through too many diverse channels, to be completely eradicated. The secret has transformed into a living tradition that continuously regenerates itself through new cultural expressions while maintaining connection to its historical origins. What began as the guarded secret of specific families has evolved into a cultural inheritance that belongs in some sense to everyone touched by Western civilization. The bloodline story has become part of our collective imagination and conceptual framework, influencing how we understand the relationship between humanity and divinity, between spiritual and temporal authority, between institutional power and personal spiritual connection. Yet this cultural diffusion doesn't diminish the historical question at its core. Behind the symbols, the art, the literature, and the secret societies lies the fundamental historical possibility that has driven all these elaborate preservation efforts, that Jesus and Mary Magdalene may have had children whose descendants walk among us still, carrying in their very DNA the most controversial heritage in Western civilization. On a spring morning in Paris, a young woman enters the Louvre Museum. She moves with purpose through the crowded galleries until she reaches Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin of the Rocks. While tourists around her snap photos and consult guidebooks, she studies the painting with unusual intensity, focusing on specific elements, the arrangement of fingers, the geometric relationships between figures, the peculiar rock formations in the background. After several minutes, she makes a brief note in a small journal and moves on to another Leonardo work, continuing what appears to be a systematic analysis of symbolic elements invisible to casual observers. Who is this woman? A graduate student, researching Renaissance art? An enthusiast of esoteric symbolism? Or perhaps someone with a more personal connection to the traditions encoded in these masterpieces? Her identity remains as ambiguous as the bloodline mystery itself, existing at the intersection of documented history, cultural mythology, and living tradition. This ambiguity has become the defining characteristic of the bloodline story in the contemporary world. The narrative exists simultaneously as historical possibility, cultural symbol, spiritual tradition, and personal identity, with the boundaries between these dimensions increasingly fluid. For some, the bloodline represents a fascinating historical puzzle. For others, a profound spiritual lineage. For still others, a direct family heritage that shapes their understanding of their place in history. The multiplicity of the bloodline story's existence creates the perfect conditions for its perpetual survival. Unlike historical claims that can be definitively proven or disproven, the bloodline narrative inhabits a liminal space between verifiable history and living tradition. It cannot be conclusively dismissed without proving a negative across 2,000 years of complex history. Yet neither can it achieve the definitive verification that would transform it from provocative possibility to established fact. What makes the bloodline story so persistently compelling is precisely this quality of existing at the threshold between history and myth. It's substantial enough to resist dismissal as mere fantasy, yet elusive enough to maintain an aura of mystery that pure historical facts would dispel. This liminal quality ensures the narrative will continue to regenerate itself through new expressions and investigations. The Vatican's relationship with this persistent narrative has evolved into a sophisticated form of information management adapted to contemporary media environments. No longer able to suppress bloodline claims, through traditional censorship, the Church has developed nuanced approaches that acknowledge public interest while deflecting historical investigation. Vatican spokespeople respond to popular books and films, exploring bloodline possibilities, with carefully calibrated statements that focus on theological implications rather than historical evidence. This strategy maintains the Church's traditional position while avoiding direct confrontation with historical questions that might lead to deeper investigation. By neither confirming nor decisively refuting bloodline possibilities, the Vatican perpetuates the ambiguity that has characterized its handling of this question throughout history. This approach preserves both institutional authority and the flexibility to adapt should compelling evidence ever force public acknowledgement. Meanwhile, certain European families maintain traditions that suggest continuing bloodline consciousness. These families preserve unusual religious practices that blend Orthodox Christianity with elements honoring the sacred feminine and acknowledging human divinity. They maintain private libraries containing genealogical records and esoteric texts. Their members often occupy positions allowing them to influence cultural institutions, historical preservation, and scholarly research related to early Christianity. These families don't publicly identify themselves as bloodline descendants. Such claims would invite skepticism and unwanted attention. Instead, they maintain private awareness of their heritage, while operating effectively within mainstream social and cultural institutions. This strategy allows them to preserve their traditions while avoiding the marginalization that would come with explicit bloodline claims. The bloodline story finds its most vivid contemporary expression in cultural productions that explore its implications. Novels, films, scholarly works, and artistic creations continuously reinterpret the possibility of Jesus' descendants living among us. Some approaches focus on historical detective work, others on spiritual implications, others on political and religious power dynamics that would be affected by bloodline verification. This cultural fertility ensures the bloodline narrative continuously regenerates in forms adapted to contemporary sensibilities. What medieval people understood through religious symbolism and Renaissance audiences absorbed through artistic encoding, modern audiences encounter through popular fiction, documentary films, and internet discourse. The core narrative remains remarkably consistent across these transformations, a testament to the story's resilience and fundamental appeal. The bloodline possibility resonates so powerfully because it addresses fundamental human questions about the relationship between divinity and humanity. If Jesus had children, their existence would represent the literal embodiment of divine incarnation, continuing through human bloodlines, a biological connection to divinity that parallels and challenges the theological connection offered by institutional religion. This concept challenges conventional boundaries between human and divine realms. Rather than divinity remaining safely contained within theological frameworks and institutional structures, the bloodline possibility suggests divine presence flowing through ordinary human genetics, accessible not through institutional mediation, but through direct biological descent. The theological implications of the bloodline possibility explain both its persistent appeal and the institutional resistance it encounters. This narrative doesn't merely challenge historical accounts. It fundamentally reframes the relationship between humanity and divinity. It suggests that divine connection might be inherited rather than institutionally conferred, a proposition with revolutionary implications for religious authority. Scientific advances have added intriguing dimensions to this ancient mystery. The emergence of genetic science offers theoretical possibilities for investigating bloodline claims that would have been unimaginable in previous eras. DNA analysis of ancient remains, population genetic studies of specific Mediterranean and European communities, and the development of techniques for extracting genetic material from historical artifacts create potential investigative approaches that bypass traditional historical methodologies. These scientific possibilities remain largely theoretical due to the absence of authenticated physical remains directly connected to Jesus or his family. If they transform the bloodline question from purely historical investigation to potential scientific inquiry, a significant evolution that adds contemporary relevance to an ancient mystery. Meanwhile, the Vatican has developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to genetic science and its implications for religious questions. The Church maintains research relationships with leading genetic research institutions, sponsors conferences exploring the intersection of genetics and theology, and employs scientists within its own academic structures. This engagement ensures Vatican awareness of emerging genetic methodologies that might eventually bear on bloodline questions. The Vatican's engagement with genetic science reflects a sophisticated institutional approach to potentially disruptive knowledge. Rather than opposing scientific advances that might challenge traditional narratives, the Church participates in their development, ensuring both awareness of emerging capabilities and influence over their interpretation and application. Archaeological discoveries continue to add new dimensions to the bloodline possibility. Excavations in Jerusalem, southern France, and other locations connected to early Christianity occasionally yield artifacts and inscriptions that revive academic discussion of Jesus' family connections. While no single discovery has provided definitive evidence for bloodline continuation, the cumulative effect of these findings maintains scholarly interest in the historical possibilities. The digital age has transformed access to information related to bloodline investigations. Historical documents once accessible only to specialized scholars with institutional credentials can now be examined by independent researchers. Worldwide, digital modeling tools allow new analysis of architectural structures potentially containing bloodline symbolism. Online communities enable collaborative investigation across traditional academic and national boundaries. This democratization of research has both advantages and limitations. While it enables broader participation in bloodline investigation, it also creates challenges for evaluating evidence quality and interpretative frameworks. The bloodline narrative now develops through complex interactions between academic scholarship, independent research, spiritual traditions, and creative interpretation, with boundaries between these domains increasingly permeable. Throughout these evolutions in how the bloodline story is investigated and expressed, the fundamental historical question remains unresolved. Did Jesus and Mary Magdalene have children whose descendants continue among us? This question hovers between tantalizing possibility and definitive answer, supported by suggestive evidence but lacking the conclusive proof that would transform religious understanding. The bloodline question exists in a uniquely balanced state of historical ambiguity, supported by enough evidence to resist dismissal as fantasy, yet not enough for definitive verification. This perfect equilibrium between possibility and certainty may itself reflect careful management by institutions and families with stakes in maintaining productive ambiguity. For the Vatican, this ambiguity serves institutional interests by containing bloodline claims within the realm of speculation rather than established fact. For families potentially connected to bloodline traditions, it provides protection from unwanted attention while preserving private identity. For scholars and researchers, it ensures continuing fascination with a historical puzzle that resists final resolution. Yet, beyond these pragmatic functions, the bloodline story's persistent ambiguity serves deeper cultural purposes. It maintains a space for mystery within our increasingly rationalized understanding of history. It preserves the possibility that our conventional narratives might contain significant omissions. It suggests that beneath official accounts might flow currents of alternative truth, preserved through unconventional channels. This capacity for simultaneous existence as historical possibility, cultural symbol, spiritual tradition, and personal identity ensures the bloodline story will continue to evolve through future generations. Like the family it describes, the narrative itself never truly dies, but regenerates through new expressions, adapted to changing cultural conditions. Perhaps this perpetual regeneration represents the bloodline's most profound legacy, not merely the biological continuation of a specific family, but the persistent cultural reminder that conventional historical narratives may not contain the full truth of our past. The bloodline story challenges us to recognize that history contains hidden dimensions, that power shapes what we know about our origins, and that truth sometimes flows through channels beyond institutional recognition. The Woman in the Louvre completes her study of Leonardo's works and exits into the Parisian Spring. Who is she? What knowledge does she carry? What traditions does she preserve? These questions remain as open as the bloodline mystery itself, suspended in the productive ambiguity that has protected and perpetuated this narrative through 2,000 years of cultural evolution. Whether understood as historical reality, spiritual metaphor, or cultural mythology, the story of the Vatican's hidden bloodline continues to whisper its challenging possibility that the divine and human realms connected not just through abstract theology, but through living bloodlines. That this connection has been simultaneously suppressed and preserved by the very institutions officially denying its existence, and that the descendants of Christianity's founder may walk among us still, their heritage hidden in plain sight, their existence challenging everything we think we know about the relationship between divinity, humanity, and the power structures built upon controlling access between these realms. In the end, the bloodline story persists because it addresses something deeper than historical curiosity or conspiracy thinking. It speaks to our fundamental desire for direct connection to the divine without institutional mediation. It suggests that divinity might flow through our very bodies rather than remaining safely contained in theological abstractions and institutional structures. It offers the tantalizing possibility that the sacred might be inherited rather than conferred, a democratization of divinity, with revolutionary implications for how we understand both our past and our spiritual potential. Family that never dies, whether literal or metaphorical, whether historically verified or productively ambiguous, continues to haunt our cultural imagination, challenging conventional narratives and inviting us to consider possibilities that lie beyond the boundaries of established history, beyond the doctrines of institutional religion, in the shadowy realm where myth and history, divinity and humanity, past and present flow together in a mystery that resists final resolution.